I'd like first to acknowledge that the State Library is built on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. For all of those who don't know me, I'm Mark Ledbury. I'm the Director of the Power Institute at the University of Sydney, the Chair of the Art History Department there too. And as you'll know, the Power Institute was established by the legacy of John Power, artist and philanthropist, and it supports research, ideas and conversation around visual art and culture. And it does this through a programme of talks, conferences and publications, one of which is proudly on display tonight. Come back to that in a minute. And you can find out more if you wish to. Sign up for our newsletter, like us on Facebook, etc., and keep up to date with all our news. We do a lot, and we hope that we'll see some of you who may not be as familiar with what we do up at the uni or elsewhere. Indeed, it's the publication side of our mission that brings us here tonight. We're delighted to be publishing together with McGill University Press in Canada, Melissa Miles' groundbreaking and very beautiful book, The Language of Light and Dark, Light and Place in Australian Photography. It's a fascinating study for many reasons, the political resonance of the light-dark binary in Australia, obviously, but among its many strengths are its tying together of landscape and industrial photography, and discussions of urban and rural aesthetics, its discussion of the way photography has made its impact in Australia through museums and collections, such a lot of innovative scholarship and some beautiful photographs, nicely designed, and for example, there are these gorgeous Max Dupain pictures of Pyrmont silos. I live in Pyrmont, and it's a long way from the silo right now, but you'll all have your own favourites, I think. We're very proud to be publishing this work and to be introducing Melissa to talk about her work and related work this evening. I should say that the book, I can't resist saying it, the book is discounted tonight. It's priced at an already reasonable $65 for such a beautiful book, but it's for you tonight $50, and you can get it signed. Special tonight discount, and there are a pile over there if you wish to see Marnie over there, and because we'll have a little time tonight for questions after Melissa's talk, and then if anyone would like to purchase a book, they'll be delighted. Someone reminded me it's fewer than 100 days till Christmas, but that's slightly frightening thought. I'll leave there for a minute. It's a great delight to introduce Associate Professor Melissa Miles tonight. She is currently an ARC Future Fellow. That's the very honorific, very competitive research fellowship given to the leading early and mid-career scholars in Australia. She's based at the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at Monash University in Melbourne. She's a scholar and historian of photography, both in Australia and internationally, the author and editor of many books and articles in photographic history, including The Burning Mirror, Photography in an Ambivalent Light of 2008, the recent edited volume, The Culture of Photography in Public Space, which came out this year. And in fact, her ARC project has much to do with with photography in the public realm and the public space. She's published on the aesthetics and politics of Google street photography, on women photographers in Australia, on Japanese-Australian photographic relationships, a project she's continuing, and on race in Australian photography. All these issues that find, I think, keen expression in this marvellous new book. And her talk this evening is entitled Cities of Light, Photography, Modernity and Artificial Illumination. Please welcome Melissa Miles.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Mark, for that lovely introduction, and to the Power Institute for bringing me up to Sydney. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to start this evening's talk on Cities of Light with this photograph by Max Dupain. It's obviously Sydney's Luna Park, an Olympic pool, and it captures the dual sense of magic and technological mastery that I'll be talking about in relation to Australian photography and also popular attitudes to artificial illumination in modern Australia. Like the dozens of Luna Parks that opened around the world and across Australia in the early 20th century, Sydney's Luna Park made spectacular use of artificial illumination. When it opened in 1935, a year before Dupain took this photograph, the amusement park was described in the paper as Sydney's biggest electrical undertaking. Over 50,000 electric lights glimmered in the night sky and turned the park into a luminous fantasy land. By framing Luna Park wide in the surrounding landscape, Dupin emphasised the magical quality of the scene. The illuminated park appears to rise up out of the harbour's deep, inky blackness in a blaze of light in the night sky, while its glow is reflected in an undefined blur in the water. The immersive dark waters swallow up all of the detail that would normally be visible by day, while the park seems to float on the water's edge like an immaterial dreamscape that's destined to disappear with the coming of the sun. Photographs of artificial illumination, like Dupin's photograph of Luna Park, offer glimpses into the complex and sometimes contradictory relationship between light and modernity in Australian photography. On one hand, the development of electric light symbolised scientific prowess and humanity's control over the natural world. But on the other, it was described in the Australian press with a sense of wonder and magic, as it offered light that produced neither smoke nor flame and required no visible fuel. The spread of electric light across the country was also seen as a marker of progress. Australian towns and cities started to display electric lights from the early 1880s. When the first electric street lights to be installed systematically were switched on in Tamworth on the 9th of November 1888, the event was described in the Sydney Morning Herald as proof of the town's success in the race for colonial progress. Penrith, Mossvale, Broken Hill and Redfern soon followed, and by 1894 most of Melbourne's city streets were lit with electricity. This connection between progress and artificial illumination was especially evident in Australia's Federation celebrations in 1901. Alec Jenkins photographs the lavish Melbourne illuminations, made in honour of the Duke and Duchess of York's visit to Australia in May 1901. One photograph shows two towers that were installed at the corners of Flinders and Swanston Streets, and another documents the arch at the foot of Elizabeth Street, which was similarly covered in brightly coloured lights. Parliament House, Treasury, Prince's Bridge, the Town Hall, Law Courts, Stock Exchange, General Post Office and the exhibition buildings were all festooned with thousands of amber, ruby, violet, emerald, pink and white lights that accentuated the building's neoclassical colonnades, its columns, domes and arches. It really would have been quite something to see. In Sydney for the Commonwealth celebrations in January and again in May for the royal visit, the electric illuminations adorned the city and its harbour to translate, according to one reporter, the enthusiasm of its people into light. An avenue of light was formed down Macquarie Street. Garden beds in the Botanic Gardens were aglow with thousands of coloured lights, and the Parliament House, Government House, and dozens of other official, commercial, and private buildings turned the city into a veritable fairyland. On Sydney Harbour, illuminated ships and ferries sent thousands of lights floating and reflecting on the water like diamonds, while extravagant fireworks displays lit up the sky. A large map of Australia was marked out in light on the facade of the city post office, with the single word United emblazoned across the front, reminding onlookers of the reason for this big celebration in light. The popularity of contemporary cultural festivals like Sydney's Vivid Festival and Melbourne's Light in Winter and White Night, which set these cities alight with magnificent artificial light installations, testify to the continued popularity of these spectacular illuminations in Australian cities. As the Commonwealth celebrations died down and the early 20th century moved on, electric light remained a highly visible sign of a nation embracing its modern future. Nonetheless, the electric illumination of suburbs and towns was a very slow process. It took place over several decades as it relied on the development of major infrastructure, including quite large-scale hydroelectric power schemes. By 1927, only 34% of homes in Australia were wired with electricity. 34%. This slow spread of electrification reflects the particular pace of modernisation in Australia. Australians didn't experience modernisation as a revolution or sudden wave of change as it was experienced in parts of Europe. Mass production manufacturing industries were not a significant part of the Australian economy until after the Second World War, and the steel and glass skyscrapers didn't really begin to reshape the skylines of its major cities until the late 1950s and early 1960s. European and American conceptions of modernity as a thrilling sense of the new displacing the old were experienced in Australia as a kind of expectation or imminence rather than a radical shift. The poet, novelist and children's writer Jean Kerr-Lewis captured this sense of anticipation in an article in Australia Beautiful, the Home Easter Pictorial in 1928. Well illustrated with photographs by Harold Casneau, Milton Kent, and others of Sydney Harbour and its thriving industries, Kerr-Lewis's article described Sydney as a city in transition, not quite one thing, nor yet the other, all memories and promises. Kerr-Lewis also wrote of the noise of the city, its hum, purr, and rhythm, as she looked forward to the Sydney of the future, themes that were to also interest and inspire quite a number of Australian photographers. This sense of slow transition was reflected in photography practice in the early 20th century. Several histories of Australian photography have described a transition or a movement from the English mists, hazy light and fuzzy effects associated with pictorialist photography, and a movement towards the crisp, sharp lines associated with modernist photography in the 1930s and 40s. However, others have noted that we must be wary about approaching this relationship between pictorialism and modernism as a linear progression of successive movements or styles. Such an approach problematically implies a natural or inevitable evolution of styles, and a somewhat limited conception of both pictorialism and modernism, which was defined largely according to European models. Between the late 1920s and 1940s, members of an older generation of Australian photographers, including pictorialists Harold Casneau and George Morris, were active at the same time as a younger generation linked to modernist and new documentary practices, like Max Dupain. Dupain made pictorial landscapes into the 1920s and 30s, while also producing modernist-inspired imagery. And as Helen Ennis has noted, Casneau often managed to synthesise modernist and pictorialist photographs and approaches to photography at the same time. As they turned their cameras towards the cities in which they lived and worked, these photographers utilised light, shadow and artificial illumination to enrich and enliven their imagery in ways that transcended these neat stylistic categories. In order to understand the complexity of Australian photography during this period, it's essential to move beyond narrow definitions of modernist photography as that which mimics certain aspects of European avant-garde practice, and broaden definitions of modernism to consider the roles of modern subjects, modern photographic technologies, and modern sensibilities in an Australian context. The play of darkness and artificial light helped photographers to articulate the sense of dynamism and immanence, much as Kerr-Lewis described. As electric light was far more stark than the former gas street lighting, it provided new opportunities for photographers of city streets by night. Light may have been approached as a means of revealing the subject in the early history of photography, but with the introduction of new electric lighting, handheld cameras and improved lenses, night photography grew much more popular, and there was also a shift and an interest in light itself as a subject in photography. Electric light also facilitated a range of new effects in photography. As city buildings receded into night's shadows, the illuminated city appeared as though it was constructed of light. Photographs didn't just capture this light, they transformed it. The spellbinding qualities of electric lights were amplified in photographs as the camera exacerbated their glare. When photographed at night, lakes and rivers carry jewels on their surface and streetlights turn into twinkling stars. Hence, Laurie Duggan writes that illuminated cities were turned into uncanny spaces where light animated the inanimate and buildings seemed to hang glittering in the air. By the 1920s, photographers were confidently experimenting with the effects of light and shade to represent the changes that they were anticipating or just beginning to experience in their cities. Artificial illumination was used to disguise, transmute, or create illusions. In Arthur Dickinson's City of Sound, organ pipes in the Melbourne Town Hall metamorphose into a thriving metropolis of high-rise buildings through strong contrasts between light and shade. It's quite possible that Dickinson was inspired by the representations of the city in the film Metropolis. Metropolis was being screened in Melbourne at the time. It first screened at the Auditorium from April 1928, and it received a lot of media attention. It was praised in the Melbourne paper, The Argus, for its brilliant photography, and may well have caught Dickinson's attention. Dickinson was the president of the Professional Photographers Association of Victoria, and also he's more well known as a portrait photographer. Yet his City of Sound is quite an imaginative, striking photograph. When it was exhibited at the 1930 Victorian Salon of Photography, one reviewer described this photograph as extremely clever and effective, while another noted that the weird lighting effect and the solemn cathedral-like atmosphere of the great organ pipes renders it exceptionally interesting. Criticisms come a long way. The organ pipes that are the photograph's subject and the reference to sound in the title allude to the noise and energy of an imagined city of the future. At this time in Melbourne, skyscrapers were just figments of the imagination. Melbourne's long-standing building height limit of 132 feet wasn't exceeded until its first skyscraper, ICI House, was opened in 1958. Kerr Lewis's contemporaneous description of Sydney as not quite one thing nor yet the other, or memories and promises, is also reflected in the formal characteristics of Dickinson's photograph. The sepia tones and soft shadows behind the pipes in City of Sound recall some of the qualities of pictorialist photography, while Dickinson's use of chiaroscuro and simplified composition look forward to some of the effects popularised with modernist photography during the 1930s. Harold Casneau's photograph Archibald Fountain at Night likewise uses artificial illumination to create a sense of action and theatre. As you'll all know, it's located in Hyde Park. This Art Deco Archibald Memorial Fountain was a popular subject for photographers, including Frank Hurley and the Melbourne photographer Peg Clark. Bequeathed to the City of Sydney by the founder and editor of the Bulletin magazine, J.F. Archibald, the fountain commemorates the association between Australia and France during the First World War. Casneau made quite a number of photographs of this fountain after it was unveiled in 1932. This one was taken from behind the central figure of Apollo and looks forward towards the gleaming, muscular form of Theseus as he vanquishes the Minotaur. The dark, misty atmosphere often associated with pictorialism obscures the city in the background and softens the glow of distant lights. This allows Casneau to isolate the fountain and intensify its theatricality. Casneau was a founding member of the Sydney Camera Circle, a group dedicated to developing Australian photography as an art. Established in 1916 by Casneau, James Peyton, Cecil Bostock, James Stenning, W.S. White and Malcolm McKinnon, the Sydney Camera Circle was described as Australia's first photographic movement. Membership to this exclusive group was by invitation only and based on the critical assessment of the applicant's work by existing members. One of the relatively small group of photographers to pass this test was George Morris, who acted as the Sydney Camera Circle's treasurer and secretary from 1926. He operated a commercial studio in Sydney, specialising in advertising and industrial photography. The city was an ongoing subject of fascination for Morris. During business trips to Europe and the United States in 1920 and 1936, he took several photographs of New York City that were later developed using the soft, grainy effects of Brom oil, which was a very popular process amongst pictorialists. The scale of Sydney in the 1930s may not have compared to New York City, but it also provided creative stimulus for Morris's photography. Morris's night view, Sydney Harbour, capitalises on darkness and artificial illumination to eliminate excess detail from the scene. Pictorialist photographers had long been aware of this power of night photography to invest subjects with moody and atmospheric qualities. Morris's night view, Sydney Harbour, encapsulates this process. It's taken from a North Shore suburb, and his photograph is framed by the dark silhouette of trees looking out across towards distant lights. Here, the romantic qualities of pictorialism are used to respond to the changing face of the city. There's a stillness in the image, and a sense that the city of commerce and industry is sleeping while nocturnal creatures are beginning to stir. The photographer Edward Searle commented on the extraordinary transformation that takes place in night photography much earlier in an article in Australasian Photo Review in 1918. He described how even the most unappealing aspects of the city become sites of poetic imagining by night. He wrote, "Unsightly hoardings and business signs are veiled in shadows, and even the banal and squalid assume the picturesque under the magic wand of night. The poetry of lights and shade and fugitive lines may be found in the nocturnal pie cart, and romance and mystery in less likely places than a coffee stall." Searle's photograph Mossman Bay by Night, made 17 years after he wrote this article, is indicative of his long-standing interest in these processes of change that occur with night photography. The night absorbs all of the suburbs surrounding Mossman Bay, leaving only silhouettes of houses and bright lights that are reflected as long streaks of water on the surface. As long streaks of light on the surface of the water. Searle noted in his article that once techniques for night photography had been mastered, the ambitious worker will aspire to represent the flow of human life that is so characteristic of parts of the city by night. This sense of the flow of human life is made beautifully apparent in Dupayne's photograph, Mossman Bay at Dusk. This view of the harbour was shot using a long exposure during evening rush hour, so that the movement of ferries on the water registered as a series of sweeping arcs of light. Sydney's busy rush hour is also the magic hour of twilight, when the mood of the city begins to shift. The photograph brings to mind the romanticism that Kenneth Slessor saw in Sydney Harbour at dusk, when he wrote, "But at sunset, when the harbour is glazed with pebbles of gold and white, and the sun is burning out like a bushfire behind Balmain, the ferryboats put on their lights. They turn into luminous water beetles, filled with a gliding, sliding, reflected glitter that bubbles on the water like phosphorus." Slessor's description of the water aglow with beetle-like ferries also reveals how notions of light and artificial illumination saw a shift of romantic approaches to nature onto technology during this period. Dupayne employed a similar process when photographing the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 1946. His longest exposure meant that the headlights of the cars traversing the bridge translated into these long strands of light that you can see on the road, which Dupayne described humorously as spaghetti. Taken from on top of the bridge's southern pylon, Dupayne's twilight peak hour Sydney Harbour Bridge centres on the bridge's great soaring curve. The unusual viewpoint, sense of dynamism, and sharp focus are indicative of a fully fledged modernist aesthetic. Yet it's important to note that this dramatic angle was as much a part of the photographic conditions in which Dupayne was working as his interest in modernist photography. The Sydney Harbour Bridge's enormous curves and towering pylons and the limited access points from which they could be photographed up close promoted such unusual viewpoints. And there's quite a lot of these quite straight documentary photographs taken by many other photographers that have quite a modernist look about them because of these forced, unusual viewpoints. So the sense of the architecture almost driving innovation in photography. These limited access points didn't stop the brash young photographer Geoffrey Powell, who 8 years earlier in 1938 illegally climbed to the top of the arch of the Sydney Harbour Bridge to photograph the sunset over Port Jackson. No safety cables for him, just straight up. Powell was arrested and charged, and in the subsequent court case claimed that his passion for photography led him to commit this act. He later became well known as a documentary photographer and filmmaker, and when he scaled the Sydney Harbour Bridge, he had not long taken up photography. After a brief stint working as Russell Roberts' assistant in 1936, Powell was offered a position as junior assistant in Japan's Bond Street studio in 1937, a position that he left in 1938 to take up freelance travel photography. During his period with Japan, Powell took this photograph, Old Theatre Royal, Sydney Night Streetscape. Powell was committed to a modernist aesthetic at this time, and along with Japan, he experimented, if only very briefly, with surrealist-inspired montage, as well as sharp focus, close-ups, and oblique camera angles. Powell's framing of Sydney's busy King Street at an angle creates a sense of activity and movement. The neon signage of the Theatre Royal, St James, and other businesses punctuate this posthumously printed photograph with graphic diagonals, while the bright street lights above create quite a dazzling blur. As a result of the slow exposure, the car in front of the theatre gains a ghostly transparency. You can only just see it, and long streaks of light run parallel to the road where cars would have travelled up that road. The magazine The Home was an important forum for promoting all that was modern and fashionable at this time, and it included quite a number of photographs of Australia's illuminated cities. This spread of photographs of King's Cross at night was made by the Japanese photographer Ichiro Kageyama, who had a studio in Sydney. He became a member of the Photographic Society of New South Wales around 1914 and exhibited regularly in Sydney and Japan for the following decades. It's quite remarkable. This is the time of white Australia. He's developing this thriving practice in Sydney. Kageyama lived in Sydney for around 30 years before the Second World War meant that he had to return to Japan. He made it out on the last repatriation ship. In the 1930s, he made quite a number of contributions to the Home magazine, and in this spread, his pictorialist approach to photography, which was very evident in his work in the 1910s and 1920s, has given way to a much crisper style. And you can see how the magazine designers have played with those diagonals that we also see in Powell's work to create that sense of the modern and the dynamic. Urban illumination was to become a highly visible sign of austerity during the Second World War, as a succession of blackouts plunged cities across the country into darkness in response to fears of night raids. Writing in the Melbourne newspaper The Argus in 1943, as an 18-month period of light restrictions in Melbourne were starting to ease, Frank Fitzgerald likened the loss of light in the city to a period of colonial expansion before the city had been founded. He says, "With war came the time of darkness. On the night of September 23, 1941, Melbourne had its first trial blackout. Melbourne, city of 1 million souls, went into darkness as black and foreboding, almost, as the darkness of the bushland in which John Batman and his men spent their first moonless nights on the edge for a village more than 100 years before." Fitzgerald's comments are indicative of the cultural connection between artificial illumination, colonial mastery of the land, and modernity, which I explore in more detail in my book. The partial end of the blackouts brought a sense of immense hope as the restoration of city light signified a return to peace. Fitzgerald wrote, "We have yet to see again the blaze of colour from the neon signs of Burke Street and Swanston, Flinders, Elizabeth and Collins Streets. To parade again in the strong white light of the city shop windows, and to blink in the dazzling glare of Luna Park and the Esplanade, St Kilda. When all these lights are restored, and the long beams of searchlights have ceased to play at night across the sky, then shall we know that the danger is really past, the horrors of war departed, and peace returned." When the war finally did come to an end, Australian cities erupted into a blaze of celebratory light. Keith Phillips was present at the VJ celebrations in Adelaide in 1945, and his remarkable photograph, Pyrotechny, was taken at the heart of the celebrations in Victoria Square. Made using a long exposure, Phillips's photograph registered the fireworks as ribbons of light flying across the night sky. A reporter from The Advertiser described the atmosphere. In Victoria Square, floodlights lit up the surroundings like day. From Montefiore Hill, Adelaide looked like a fairy city. Coloured neon lights, searchlights, floodlights, rockets, Roman candles and the headlights of motor cars threw a great lurid glow across the sky. A statue of Adelaide's founder, the aptly named Colonel William Light, stands at the centre of Phillips's photograph with fireworks soaring triumphantly through the sky behind it. One trail of light seems to shoot from Colonel Light's pointed finger, while the upturned heads of onlookers are reduced to silhouettes at the bottom of the composition. This photograph remains a potent reminder of artificial illumination's enduring power to ignite imagination and its fragility as a symbol of progress and prosperity. As Sydney's building height restrictions were lifted in 1957 beyond the former limit of 150 feet, new steel and glass skyscrapers facilitated new approaches to visualising cities through photography. The combination of modern architecture, artificial illumination and photography produced what Duggan referred to as a kind of double negative, in which architectural solids and voids shift. The structures of modern buildings take on indefinite form at night and disappear into the darkness, while light emphasises the recession of those internal spaces. Dupin became increasingly involved in architectural photography during the 1960s. The Australian modernist architect Harry Seidler praised Dupin's fantastic eye for light, and Dupin considered his architectural photography amongst his best work. In Dupin's nighttime photograph, Qantas House, material and immaterial overlap in an ephemeral, somewhat intangible experience of space and light. Designed in 1950 by Felix Taverner of Littlemore and Rudder, Qantas House was completed in 1957. The light shining through the windows contrasts with the structure in Dupin's closely framed photograph to create a sense of a dark grid that sweeps dramatically up and across the field and accentuates the sense of movement of the curved facade. This photograph consequently resonates with Duggan's comments on nocturnal urban photography. It is light itself that is the subject. The photographs and the city that they reveal are nothing but constructions of light. Now, those of you with a keen eye will have noticed that all of the photographers that I've spoken about tonight have one thing in common. They're all men. Some nodding heads, I'm glad you noticed. And this doesn't sit well with me. As I describe in my book, experiences of women photographers were very different to male photographers in the early 20th century. Photography may have been promoted as an ideal hobby for women photographers in newspapers and advertising campaigns during this period, but it was very difficult for women to maintain successful photography businesses. Most professional female photographers occupied positions in the background of studios and tended to give up their careers when they married. The Examiner's Estelle Campbell argued in 1935 that photography was a suitable hobby for married women as it could result in splendid photographs of the children. but subscribed to the popular view that wives and mothers should not pursue a career. There were, of course, exceptions. Ruth Hollick, Peg Clark, and May and Minna Moore, all addressed in the book, had fabulous professional studios. But they tended to work more with portrait photography or landscapes. In terms of photographing the city at night, which is the subject of tonight's talk, women didn't really enjoy the same freedom and sense of security in the city at night as men did. Hence the domination of photographs by men in this genre. So while the photographs that we've been looking at tonight are very compelling, it's also important to have a think about the absences, what I'm not discussing, and think about why these absences are there. The variability of light and darkness has proved a powerful means of expressing very different responses to a modern city. During the early to mid-20th century, Australian photographers utilised the subtleties and extremes of light and dark to represent their hopes for city of the future, and later to comment more critically on the more challenging urban realities. The formal and symbolic complexity of this photographic engagement with light and darkness points to the continuing need to develop more histories and new histories of Australian photography that move beyond linear narratives about the progression from pictorialist myths to a crisp modernist aesthetic. By returning to Australia's immense archives of photographs like those held in this fabulous library, an ever more nuanced and multifaceted picture of the history of Australian photography can be developed. Thank you.